So I became involved with MotorCities National Heritage Area really before it began. Harold Scramstad was the director of the Henry Ford Museum, and my parents were close friends with he and his wife, and there were sort of rumblings of an interest in trying to create a cultural initiative around automotive heritage. And so really it was in the 90s. I was still in Boston. I was living and working in Boston and working on other heritage areas across the country. And so Harold and his partner in crime, Ed Begale, who was at U of M Dearborn, they were aware of the thesis I had done. I had written my master's thesis at MIT on the Ford Rouge plant and on the auto industry with an eye toward a hopeful and sustainable future for that particular globally significant resource. So came out, we did a quick study in 1995. I was working at the time with Icon Architecture in Boston, and then that became the basis, really, I think, for coalescing all of the various partners around the notion of the legislation for the heritage area. And I think is very important. I think designers are good at several things. I mean, we're good at asking questions, we're good at observation, and hopefully we're good at listening. And there were many voices to listen to here in the Detroit area, many different groups, some very powerful, like I said, like the Henry Ford Museum and the auto companies and the UAW, others very grassroots, talking about their passion for this globally significant story. So we listened, we documented, we sort of coalesced that into a cohesive vision, and hopefully one that was compelling, to say this is our story, and we're proud of that story, and here's how we might go about interpreting it for the world.
Sure.
I think the question of geography and boundaries is really fundamental and interesting. I mean, we talked about Nancy Darga's initiative with the Village Industries, which were really sort of north and west of the urbanized area of Detroit. We mentioned Harold Scramstad and Ed Begale, who really were zeroing in on the Lower Rouge, first from an natural environmental point of view, and then layering on the cultural. And I really, I think once you touch this story and start to touch resources, it's like spontaneous generation, right? There's really nowhere in regional Detroit, and I include Windsor in Canada as part of regional Detroit as well. With the river kind of as a center point. But once you start to touch that story, it does expand to all the cities, both in southeastern Michigan and across the state. And I have to credit again. We were designers. We had a particular perspective on how you might go about that. But I have to credit the local advocates and leaders that really made those decisions and said they wanted to be inclusive and expansive. Well, it's interesting to talk about the search of the executive director. It was never a logical step in my mind. Apparently it was for others. So I think by some combination of Harold and Ed and a couple of other, members who had been involved, that my name was thrown into the mix. And so again, I was back in Boston. I was practicing architecture. At that time, I was working. I had left Lane Frenchman, Icon, and I had started working for the Central Artery Tunnel project, and doing more sort of pure. Thank you. That's nice of you. I had left Lane Frenchman and Icon, and I was working for the Central Artery Tunnel project, doing more architecture and urbanism work, integrating public art into the Central Artery. So I, still had maybe a personal interest in the National Heritage Area, but had moved on professionally. But I do remember the interview process. I remember having a initial interview in Boston. A couple board members came out and talked to me, and then they flew me out here, and of course it was all very familiar. Steve Hamp at the time was running the museum, yeah. And I remember interviewing with the board there, and just very familiar, you know, feel like coming back home. But I think, you know, I think the final push really was, and I think I mentioned this at the August event, when I was offered the job as the first executive director, and then I was a bit wavering because, you know, we were very happy in Boston, and so Harold Scramstad called me. Harold Scramstad called me up and he said, "You've been called," you know, sort of saying, "You must take this position." So that was sort of the final thing, is feeling, yeah, you know, like everyone else involved in the heritage area, I had a personal connection to the story. I was very passionate about it, and you know, I think given my education and my profession in architecture and urbanism, you know, felt that this had a very powerful potential for the future of Detroit and the future of Michigan. Sure. It was an enormous undertaking, and I remember one, you know, in terms of the GMP, and I'd done these with firms that I'd worked for in Boston. I'd worked with the National Park Service for a decade, so I was very familiar with the whole process. But when I landed here in Detroit, I remember the very first board meeting that I attended as executive director, and I did a little back of the envelope calculation and realized we had 18 months to deliver the GMP to the Department of Interior. Our deadline was November 6, 2001. I don't think I'm ever going to forget that date. And so that was everything from, you know, writing the request for proposal, the RFP, getting that out, coordinating with the Park Service, you know, soliciting those proposals, doing the interviews, getting a team on board. So by the time we had gone through all of that, we had about a year to actually produce the plan. And so it's great to talk about the origins of the actual staff, the operations for the Heritage Area. Of course, the board had been in place since the legislation had been signed, and they had been working together. They were you know, I think a very effective and enthusiastic group. When I arrived, there was no office, there was no staff. I actually was living in the Omni Hotel. I mean, we're sitting here at Stroh River Place, which I'm very excited about. Because that's where our first office was located, and so when I arrived, you know, living at the Omni, now it's not the Omni anymore, I've forgotten the name of it, but right on the river, ultimately one of our board members, Mary Hebert, who had a very active advocacy for the river and knew John Stroh, and so I believe, I think I'm accurate here in saying that Mary convinced John to donate the space for the office. Even before we began the RFP process, the search for the consultants, I had to start building the staff. So Michael Carter, Arthur Mullen, who came to us from the city of Detroit, he had been working in the Planning and Development Department, came highly recommended. Pamela Rhodes-Todd, Brenda Plackmeyer, who worked in education and interpretation. So it was quick. Everything happened very quickly because I needed them all in place, right, in order to carry out the GMP. So we went from sort of 0 to 60 in automotive terms over the course of a couple months. I always likened it to building a house and living in it at the same time. We did begin the initial grants program for the stewardship communities, and Arthur Mullen managed that. And I think that was a program I was very proud of. It dispersed the sort of the largesse of the heritage area in a very equitable manner. It rewarded initiative. There was, and we heard this at the gala event. there's no lack of passion across the heritage area, but I think that there were certain groups within the stewardship communities that were ready to go. You know, they had projects, they had things they wanted to do, and even those small initial investments that we made, and of course there was a board member that was, you know, on that, had a committee and made those decisions with the staff. But I think that's a program. I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled that it's continuing and that it's grown, and it sounds like it's really made a huge difference.
Sure.
Just the identity program and the awareness program, you know. I don't even know if any of these materials still exist, but the materials were beautiful. That were actually published, the executive summary for the plan, the different brochures for the stewardship communities, and so I hope that, you know, I think that now has evolved, I think, with the current leadership of the heritage area, the staff, into a much more regionally based awareness program, which is, I think, critically important. Well, and I was so inspired at the gala that the current staff, and Sean and you, Brian, and the leadership of the heritage area is really focused on the future, and I think that's so important. You know, we're interpreting stories not only of the past, but of the present, hopefully, of the current context. And one thing that I very much hope for is that the heritage area will really embrace its role in regard to economic development. I think that and this is not necessarily an original idea, many other heritage areas have become intrinsically involved in, you know, the future of the industries that they're interpreting. And so, you know, and I would point to steel, for instance, in Pittsburgh. You know, they're not only interpreting that story, but they're talking about, all right, we have a structural loss of 400,000 jobs in American steel, and those, you know, those laborers, those, you know, have skills and abilities, and, you know, how is it that the heritage area can be involved in their futures, you know, and much more about education, job training, quality of life in the region that this heritage area is actually embracing and interpreting.
No.